Kruse coming up today on Undivided. Why is the Seattle media sanitizing the views of pro-Hamas socialists? Also, we'll have the story of a Seattle landlord who is now homeless while his tenant seemingly lives a lavish lifestyle. Also coming up, the chair of the Washington State Democratic Party vows to clean up our Constitution if the party can win supermajorities in 2026. That and more coming up today on Undivided. You can support the show for $5 a month by signing up at undividedpod.com. Hello and welcome to Undivided. Thank you for being here. Thank you for your commitment to giving common sense a comeback. I'm Brandi Kruse. We're a few minutes delayed today because, we fit in a doozy of a story that came up this morning that we're like, we got to punch that in the show today. So we'll get to that coming up. Over the weekend, there continued to be protests really across the country as it relates to what's happening in the Middle East. And yes, there have been pro-Israel gatherings. And yes, there have been pro-Palestine gatherings. And yes, there have been what I could only characterize as pro-Hamas gatherings. And there was a protest, we'll call it so far, in Seattle, in Westlake Park, that I don't know if the media in Seattle huddled together and said, hey, how do we want to cover this? Because it's the only thing I can think of, because the coverage of this, what was billed as a pro-Palestine protest, was so eerily similar between three TV stations, King, Como, and Fox 13, my old employer. So much so, and I want to start by just showing you a headline comparison. And this isn't, I'll preface this by saying, sometimes you see the same headline in different news publications because what it is an article from the Associated Press. It's a wire service. So publications subscribe to the wire service, they get the story, and that's why sometimes you see multiple news organizations have the exact same headline. This is not that. We checked. These are not Associated Press articles. So here is how Fox 13 and Como News both chose to characterize a pro-Palestine gathering at Westlake Park in Seattle. The Fox 13 headline: protesters fill Seattle Park calling for peace, humanitarian aid in Gaza after deadly attacks. The Como News headline: protesters fill Seattle Park with calls for peace, humanitarian aid in Gaza following deadly attacks. Again, that's not a wire service. Those are articles. The body of the articles are different, written by two different reporters for two different news stations that ended up having almost the exact same headline. And I know why. It is because you had two reporters for two news stations who bought hook, line, and sinker the narrative that protesters who were members of the Democratic Socialist Party were feeding them. They took it, they regurgitated it out back to their thousands and thousands of viewers across Washington State without challenging it, without questioning it. And I'm going to show that to you detail by detail. So I want to start with simply a montage that we put together of, again, the news stories that aired on this particular protest on Como News, Fox 13, and King 5. And I want you to see and hear for yourself how similar the narratives are that they put out there.
Angry, determined, and calling for justice for the people of Palestine. About 1,000 demonstrators turned out at Westlake Park.
Protesters filled Seattle's Westlake Park Saturday, calling on the Israeli government to abandon plans for a full-scale ground assault in northern Gaza.
Free, free Palestine!
Calls for freedom and calls for the attacks by Israel on Gaza to stop echoed Saturday throughout the streets of downtown Seattle.
Protesters say in addition to a halt in the fighting, they also want Israel to end its occupation of Muslim land.
These demonstrators are calling for an end to the bloodshed.
It's a complete massacre.
People at the rally also denounced the U.S. for its ongoing support of Israel, saying too many lives have already been lost.
With an attack by Israel looming on Gaza, one rally organizer says concern is high, but this is nothing new.
Hundreds in the crowd made their voices heard.
4, 6, 7, 8, Israel is a racist state.
They hope that attacks will stop and civilians will stop dying.
And Connor, this was a large-scale rally. This is just one of the rallies like these held this week, and more are also planned.
Yeah, the rally organizer you just heard from said they're going to keep holding these events in Seattle to make sure that their voices are heard.
Now, if you're a viewer of one of those stations, and that's where you primarily get your news, you would leave those stories of the belief that there was nothing at all controversial said or done at that pro-Palestine gathering in downtown Seattle. And that is, of course, not the case. If you watched Fox or watched Como News, you would have also been fed unfiltered talking points from a representative for the Democratic Socialists of America. In fact, those two stations not only chose to have the featured person in their stories be this individual who's a Democratic Socialist, which is really just a socialist in Seattle, but they also chose the exact same soundbite to feed to their viewers.
And it's sad to see ordinary Israeli civilians that get killed. That shouldn't have happened, in my opinion. And also, there shouldn't be ordinary working class Palestinians being killed either.
Now, that's a very reasonable talking point for this Democratic Socialist to say, yeah, it's sad to see civilians killed no matter which side they're on. But of course, the news stations who covered that sanitized the views of Democratic Socialists and didn't push back to many other assertions that were made on camera and during this protest. I want to play just a few instances in these stories where there were comments or claims or video that the reporters did not push back against at all.
The demonstrators holding signs that read "Free Palestine." The crowd demanded the focus be on restoring human rights to the people of Gaza and providing humanitarian aid to the war-torn region.
People at the rally also denounced the U.S. for its ongoing support of Israel, saying too many lives have already been lost.
Settlers have been rejoicing massacres. Shame!
Settlers have been rejoicing massacres. Shame. Settlers have been rejoicing massacres. Shame. And of course, that's an individual referring to Israelis who pro-Palestinian people say are settlers. And they're saying Israelis are rejoicing massacres of Palestinian civilians. Now, did the reporter on this story go up to that individual and say, hey, what about individuals who've been at rallies like this one who are rejoicing the massacres of Hamas? No, of course not. You also saw in that clip there, it was from Como News, where they said that protesters were holding signs that said "Free Palestine." It was all just love and joy and peace. They didn't know that there were also signs, many of them at this particular protest, that said resistance is justified when people are occupied. So there were signs that were blatantly supporting the actions of Hamas. And by I mean the actions of Hamas, the terrorism of Hamas, the rape of women, the rape of young girls, the murder of babies. Now, I'd also say, in addition to, again, and the primary overarching issue here, if there had been, look, there is a side of this and a side at the pro-Palestine rally that I take no issue with, and I think a reasonable person would take no issue with, the assertion that you have 1 million plus people in Gaza, many of them families, women and children who've been told to evacuate to southern Gaza on a timeline that's simply not realistic. And so it's certainly fine for people to come out and say, hey, we don't want civilian casualties. What happened in Israel was heartbreaking, and we don't want women and children in Gaza to be injured either. The issue is absolutely no pushback from any of the reporters. If you watch their stories, you would simply believe that these are all a bunch of peace-loving individuals. The issue is these reporters either didn't care to do their homework on some of the people who they featured in their stories, or they just didn't have the time, or they didn't have the will to do it. They didn't want to do it because they have a particular bias. So in particular, there was one woman who made cameos in 2 of the stories. In one of the stories, she was simply shown on video. We can show you guys side by side. In the other one, in a King 5 story, she was actually interviewed. Here's the clip of her being interviewed by King 5.
I've been concerned for over 75 years during this occupation, so this is something that unfortunately we are used to, and that's why we're out in the streets today.
So here you have this woman put forth by King 5 as an absolutely sympathetic figure. Here you have this woman at this protest in Westlake Park that all 3 of these media outlets have made out to be this total peace-loving crowd who just doesn't want innocent people to get hurt. The issue is that just a few days before this particular protest, that exact woman was a featured speaker at a protest at the University of Washington, where the flyers for that protest celebrated and featured their paragliders from Hamas who paraglided in to a music festival and slaughtered innocent civilians. And that exact woman, who again was a featured speaker at that event, celebrated the rebellion.
I promise you, Palestine will be free! Intifada! Intifada! Long live Intifada!
So now, with that knowledge under your belt, doesn't featuring her in coverage of a protest where you've made all these people out to be pacifists, doesn't that undermine your reporting? Doesn't that change entirely the feeling of your reporting, the feeling of your stories that you've put forth of these are just a bunch of people who don't want any more innocent individuals killed, and then you have a soundbite with a woman who was just days earlier at the University of Washington at a rally that was explicitly celebrating Hamas terrorists and calling for an intifada? I mean, this is either a complete dereliction of duty when it comes to these journalists, or it is bias. I tend to think it's just absolute laziness, and it's just the type of reporting where you go somewhere and you point to camera and you regurgitate exactly what people say and you don't push back at all. Either way, it's incredibly dangerous. It's incredibly embarrassing for the state of journalism. And it's also spreading to hundreds of thousands of households in Washington state, a completely false and watered down and sanitized narrative of what is happening in the Middle East. And it is not just the TV stations that are doing this. I looked on the Seattle Times today, and they have a whole section on the Seattle Times that is dedicated to the Hamas-Israel war. And this isn't changed at all. I took a screen grab of it. Right now, they're featuring 4 stories. All of them have an anti-Israel bend or a pro-Gaza bend. Twins born in Gaza after their mother flees to the south. And again, I feel bad for civilians caught up in a humanitarian crisis for them. But that is a story that's meant to be sympathetic toward Palestinians. The next headline, Israel vows to destroy Hamas. What happens to Gaza at the war's end? The next one, Biden warns Israel not to occupy Gaza. The next one, humanitarian aid is stuck at Gaza-Egypt border as Israel's siege strains hospitals and water supply. And really, none of this is a particular surprise. The Seattle media has been sanitizing absolute fringe views on the left for some time. Here you have a gathering of socialists in Seattle who are excusing atrocities. Well, the Seattle media has been sanitizing the views of socialists in Seattle for years and years and years. Be it, the BLM movement and marches where the Seattle media didn't push back against clear crimes, against violence and disorder because it was done in the name of a cause that they agreed with. And so this is really no surprise that the Seattle media would turn around and the same group of socialists who cause chaos and violence on the streets of Seattle all the time. I mean, look at what they did in 2020. It's some of the same people in the crowd, by the way. That the Seattle media would absolutely downplay it, would cherry pick and choose what signs to show. The peaceful signs, free Palestine, not the signs that saying the resistance, the Hamas terror attacks were justified. So it's either just blatant bias, which is probably part of it. I think a lot of it is a lack of understanding of world events, reporters who just don't know any better and who are just approaching their job in the absolute laziest and easiest way possible. Let's point a camera and let's just say what's on it. But the result is the same. Whether it's incompetence or bias, the result is the same. The result is a populace in Washington state getting their news and information from these TV stations, from these newspapers that are all covering it in the same way, that are all covering it in a deeply dishonest way. And so I wanted to show you, because I'm sure even if you watch one of those stations, you didn't see the coverage of all the stations compared in that way, and to see how similar and how wrong They actually were. All right, a couple things I want to just touch on today. So ballots are going to start to come out in the next couple days, in case you weren't aware. So the November election, it's an off-year election, but I think it's incredibly consequential. First of all, in Seattle, for the love. I don't know if I could just plead with you. I'm not a Seattle voter anymore. You know, you have 7 of 9 Seattle City Council seats that are on the ballot. You won't have an opportunity to affect change like this for another 4 years. And I am terrified to think what will happen to the city in the next 4 years if Seattle voters don't have a change of heart. If they vote in incumbents who have contributed to this public safety crisis, who have been in office and contributed to the policies that have allowed homelessness and substance abuse and crime to flourish, that have made Seattle an unwelcoming place for tourists, for residents, for shoppers, for businesses. And so this is an opportunity, and I really hope Seattle voters take advantage of it to truly change course. And as ballots arrive, we'll continue to have coverage of some of these races and of some of, I think, the really important issues to keep in mind. But I also want to look a little larger than that. There was a solitary tweet sent out over the weekend that to me is absolutely terrifying. You know, I've talked a lot on this show about, I'm not a particular fan of both parties, but I'm very hard on Democrats because they're the party in power. They've had a trifecta in the legislature 14 of the last 20 years, which means they control the House, the Senate, and the governor's office. They've had the governor's mansion for 40 years, and yet they continue to want to shirk responsibility for the crises that have gotten exponentially worse over the last 10 years. Around homelessness, around crime, around mental health issues, our bloated budget, the overtaxation of individuals, the strain on the working class. You have the same party that's been in power, universally so, and they, for some reason, find ways to get people to continue to vote for them, find ways to get people to put blame on Republicans, which is absolutely absurd to me. But I've also talked about how this consolidation of power among Democrats in Washington state is incredibly dangerous. It's not in keeping with the spirit of the country and the spirit of what our founding fathers expected our government to look like. And when you have one party in power, and I'd feel the same dang way if we were in a red state, a deep red state that had a universal Republican control. It's not healthy. Echo chambers are no place to solve problems. When you have an echo chamber, you have no backstops for the worst impulses of a party. And in this state, we've seen that. We've seen what the worst impulses of Democrats with no check on their power has led to. We've seen the terrible bills that they've pushed through that have eroded public safety. We've seen the lies that they've been able to tell without consequence about things like the carbon tax, and now the intense pressure it's putting on working class people at the gas pump. Now, the consolidation of their power, it's not lost on them. They see it. And they are looking for opportunities actively to see how far they can take that power, to see what they can do to strengthen their power even further. And if you don't believe me, I want you to listen to these words from the chair of the Washington State Democratic Party, Shasti Conrad. She tweeted over the weekend, "With supermajorities, we can clean up the Constitution. My goal for 2026, with supermajorities, we can clean up the Constitution. My goal for 2026. If that doesn't terrify every single person who believes fundamentally that the government should answer to the people it serves, I don't know what would get you to be terrified and to take seriously the threat of one-party rule. That's the goal of the chair of the Washington State Democratic Party for 2026, is to achieve supermajorities above and beyond their current majorities so that they can clean up our state constitution. I didn't realize that it needed to be cleaned up. Now, that comment from her was in response to just some person on Twitter who was criticizing the Washington State Constitution, saying that there are entire sections that they'd like to strike, and specifically, they were talking about access to voting. And I just want to show you that because Shasti Conrad is going to try to change her, I guess, position on what it was that prompted her to say something so egregious, because that was her response when she responded to this person on Twitter talking about how the Washington State Constitution it just isn't very good, and she wants to change areas specific to voting. And that's when Shasti Conrad said, with supermajorities, we can clean up the Constitution, my goal for 2026. But then when she was criticized for her words by former House Minority Leader J.T. Wilcox, who's a Republican, but a very moderate Republican. I mean, so much so that he gets called a rhino all the time. So he had shared her comments and said this should provide some incentive to vote. You might not have your first choice at the top of the ticket, but the state D chair says you have everything at stake in the legislative elections. There's no limit to her appetite. So he shares her tweet, and then she changes her tune and claims, oh, it was about abortion. She says, yeah, I meant what I said. We need to enshrine reproductive rights in our state constitution. When the far-right R's are calling you pure evil, I guess you're onto something. So first of all, J.T. Wilcox is not far-right. This is a common tactic that is used to vilify reasonable Republicans. Again, there's truly far-right people who call him a rhino all the time. But now she goes to saying, oh, because she knows it's more politically popular, well, I want to enshrine abortion rights. No, that's not what you were talking about when you made the initial tweet. Again, this should terrify everyone, and specifically coming from this person. So Shasti Conrad, this is her first year as the chair of the Washington State Democratic Party. But keep in mind who she is and where she came from. Before taking that job, she was the chair of the King County Democratic Party. And while she was the chair of the King County Democratic Party, who did she endorse? Who did she support for the job of Seattle City Attorney? She endorsed Nicole Thomas Kennedy. Nicole Thomas Kennedy was the far-left fringe activist who ran against Republican Ann Davison. Now, thankfully, Republican Ann Davison won, but Shasti Conrad is so highly ideological, so focused on Republicans not winning anything, that instead of voting or saying, I'm not even going to take a position, she supported a candidate in Nicole Thomas Kennedy who called cops serial killers, who had tweets celebrating arson, who had tweets celebrating people who lit construction trailers on fire at the site of the youth jail, not even knowing whether human beings were inside those construction trailers. So this is a chair of the state Democratic Party who is so extreme. She openly supported the most extreme political candidate on the left that the state of Washington has ever seen. And that's saying a lot. And now she says her goal in 2026 is to work toward Democratic supermajorities so she can clean up the Washington State Constitution. Is that the woman whose hands you want on the state constitution? Not a chance in hell. Not a chance in hell. And you wonder why I am so absolutely opposed to one-party rule. You wonder why I have been supportive of some Republican candidates, despite the fact that I'm not a Republican myself. It is because if there's something that I'm more scared of than the absolute disaster that is the two-party system in this country, I am far more terrified of one-party rule. And that's what we have in Washington State, and it shows. So I will do everything within my power, any ounce of influence that I have in this state, to make sure that certainly Democrats don't get supermajorities in 2026. So Shasti Conrad, an absolute fringe leftist, cannot put her grubby hands on the state constitution. But also, I will do everything in my power with every ounce of influence that I have to make sure that there's a little bit of balance, in fact, in Washington State. So we can stop absolutely insane people like this from making any changes that are going to make our state even worse. I mean, that kind of stuff terrifies the hell out of me. So Seattle voters, please don't give Democrats, don't give them any reason to march toward 2024 and beyond, thinking that they're untouchable. One of the things I've said in the Seattle City Council elections, when I say you've got to throw out the incumbents, one of the reasons that I've said that is because if there are no consequences, then they know that there are no consequences. So even, in the three races where there's incumbents in the city of Seattle, even if you have two candidates who are kind of the same, throw out the incumbent. Show that there are consequences for failed policies, I beg of you. All right, coming up next, an unbelievable story that we talked about on yesterday's episode of Sundays with Subscribers with a Seattle landlord, a homeowner, who is now homeless because of a deadbeat tenant protected by Seattle's woke policies. We'll discuss that coming up next. But first, we've been talking about our friend Wes Jones, a wonderful real estate agent in our area. If you're thinking about selling your home, we talked to Wes Jones about where he would encourage you to start.
Oh, I think the first step is having an idea of maybe what your home is worth, and having that kind of baseline home value. And that's something that we can do complimentary. You can go to the website, sellwithwes.com. You just plug in your address and we'll get you a value range. And if you want, and if you're serious, I'll come out and do a quick, market analysis for you. That's all complimentary. And then at that time or another time, we could walk through the basic steps of what it would take to get your home ready for the market.
Yeah, and his team have some cool stuff, including the Listing Boost concierge service. So if you need to sell your home, but maybe you've lived in it for a while, you didn't make the updates that maybe you had thought about making, wanted to make, well, they can come in. He can do an assessment of your home, see if any upgrades need to be done to make sure your home shines when it hits the market, and they can even help you pay for it up front, and then you just pay them back at closing, which I think is really cool. So visit sellwithwes.com, sellwithwes.com. You can start by simply using their home value calculator to see how much your home is worth. It might be worth more than you think. All right, the next story is proof that hardworking people, working class people, are being absolutely screwed over by woke policies who, in this case, protect a hands-down deadbeat. Let's get to it. This segment is brought to you in partnership with our friends over at Future 42. Turn your frustration into action at future42.org. Make sure you sign up to for their newsletter to make sure that you're notified of opportunities to, attend common sense events and make your voice heard. All right. If you are an undivided subscriber, you have already heard the story of Jason Roth because we had a half-hour-long interview with him on yesterday's episode of Sundays with Subscribers. So if you haven't seen it yet, I encourage you to become a subscriber at undividedpod.com. It's just $5 a month. But this story is really too critical not to bring to the rest of you on Monday, so we want to play some clips from that interview. So Jason Roth is 32 years old. He is, Nicole and I both found him to be one of the kindest, most sympathetic figures I think we'd ever had on the show or interviewed. Just a good guy. I think that's...
Absolutely.
I mean, I fell in love with him as just as a subject for the show as soon as I heard his story. And he has a dog that's adorable named Wally. So Jason Roth, he set out at the age of 25 to try to put his skills into action to create a better life for himself. And he wanted to find a fixer-upper home in Seattle that he could flip and turn into a rental. So here is part of our interview with him about that yesterday. How old are you?
I'm 32.
32. So when did you become a homeowner?
In 2016, I was knocking on doors in a sort of lower income neighborhood of Seattle, looking for a fixer-upper house to use my skill set to create a nice little rental. And I did find one. And I was able to get friends to help and was able to give them affordable bedrooms. And I did that for 7 years.
Yeah. So that's awesome. 25-year-old goes out, knocks door to door, wants to find a house that he can buy and that he can flip and turn into a rental. I mean, that's the kind of person who we should be celebrating, who wants to contribute in that way and who wants to be a small landlord to provide what? Affordable housing to people. Isn't that what progressives say is so important? So anyway, he rents this out for a couple years, and then he is on the cusp of moving out of state for work. He's trying to get his pilot license and further his career in that way. And so he decides to use a rental agency to find a tenant and to completely manage this particular rental property, only to find out, after a year's time, they go back to him and say that we're not gonna manage this property anymore. What they didn't tell him is that the tenant that they had put in there wasn't paying rent.
In 2022, I was planning on getting a job out of state, and I wanted to try renting the house out and using a property management company. I used a certain company to find this tenant for me. Like I said, I hadn't really used the whole traditional background check system before. And so I wanted to put trust in a company to do that for me. And they let me down supremely.
Okay, keep going.
They managed the house for 1 year with him in it. So there was 1 year where things were going good. They decided not to renew the lease, but they offered to me to keep the tenant, and they implied he was in good standing. That's a whole nother issue that I'm dealing with right now. But they left me with the hot potato, so to speak.
So they had managed it. They didn't want to continue to manage the lease.
No, because they failed to let me know that they were in legal proceedings with this tenant.
So here you have this young landlord puts his trust in a rental agency to find a good tenant to manage the company. They come back a year later. They say, hey, we don't want to manage this, your house anymore, but you can keep the tenant if you'd like. You can go through the tenant and just do that between you and him. But they failed to tell him that the tenant hadn't been paying rent and that they were, in fact, in legal proceedings to try to get the money owed to them by that tenant. So basically, they were trying to put their problem back on Jason Roth. So he thinks to himself, well, okay, yeah, if you're just, I've already got a tenant, why would I want this tenant? I don't know that there's any issues with this tenant. So he enters an agreement directly with this tenant. And before long, during that process, he starts to realize that there's a problem. The tenant, suggests and says, well, I can get you the whole deposit at once. And they make an agreement to, have that be a payment plan. And then the tenant starts to hint at maybe not being able to afford the first month's rent. And in fact, the tenant never paid Jason Roth rent. And this is going back to March. So since that tenant since Jason Roth took over the lease with his tenant in March, he's only been paid a total of $1,000 since then. And he believes that this tenant truly never intended to pay him rent. He just intended to use the system to squat in his home. I asked Jason Roth about now the court proceedings to try to evict him and how long and complicated and difficult all of that is.
The delays involved for me have been the biggest problem. Mm-hmm. So like getting the certificate for that eviction resolution pilot program could take up to a month. Getting the court date could take 3 to 4 months. Once the court date comes, their Housing Justice Project, I believe, gives them a free lawyer on the day of so that it gets automatically continued another 3 to 4 months.
And you don't get a free lawyer.
No, my lawyer is very expensive. If he's listening to this, I think you're a great lawyer. Every phone call's a lot.
Yeah.
It's more than I make in a day. So
he's had to put his whole life on hold. He's had to not move out of state to deal with all of this. He is having to hire an attorney at his own expense to try to get this tenant, who never intended to pay him any rent, out of his home. And those tenants, because the city of Seattle is so woke, those tenants get free attorneys through the Housing Justice Project. And so certainly there's no monetary obligation for them to hurry things along to get a resolution. And this gets worse. In fact, it's the most egregious tenant-landlord story I've ever heard. So Jason Roth, as he's trying to work with this tenant to get something from him, giving him payment plans, offering him payment plans, but getting nothing in return, as he's then starting the court proceedings to try to get this tenant evicted, Jason Roth finds out that this tenant is listing a floor of the house on Airbnb.
He was in default from day one, and I found out he was maintaining an Airbnb there that month, and I would drive by there almost every day, and I'd see new cars and new people coming in and out of the house. It's just unacceptable.
So how much was he making off of the Airbnb while he was simultaneously not paying
Depends on the month, but in the summer, I think it was going for $150 to $200 a night.
Wow.
It was rented every night.
Yeah. And at this point,
makes your blood boil.
Where are you living?
My van. I have a cozy camper van.
How long have you been living in your van?
Since the summer. I mean, I stayed part-time. I crashed with friends. I have family in the area. But, yeah, I mean, it just sucks. I shower at my gym.
Sorry. 32 years old, homeowner, virtually homeless.
Yeah. I mean, could I go find another apartment, like a dirt cheap bedroom somewhere? Probably. But I have school to pay for. I have bills. I have this house to pay for. Like, I don't want to go into debt. I mean, I will sleep wherever I need to make sure I don't, go into debt or start struggling in other ways. I will sacrifice my comfort right now to get this done.
You heard that correctly. Jason Roth, 32 years old, a homeowner, who was providing affordable housing for the citizens of Seattle through a rental that he bought at the age of 25 and fixed up, who now is stuck with a deadbeat renter who wasn't paying him rent but was listing the house to make money on Airbnb. Jason Roth, as a result, is left sleeping in his van with his dog. He's sleeping in his freaking van with his dog. Oh, and to make matters worse about the Airbnb listing, how was this individual who was living in a house that wasn't his, paying rent, how was he allowed to list a floor of that home on Airbnb? Well, that tenant got a permit from the city of Seattle. That tenant convinced the city of Seattle to grant him a permit to run a short-term rental. Now, Airbnb has since taken down the listing. The city of Seattle has since acknowledged to Jason Roth its mistake. It was basically the honor system. Somebody came to them, I want to rent my house out on Airbnb. He didn't show any proof that he owned the house. He didn't show any proof that if he was a renter, he had permission from the owner of the house to list it on Airbnb. And the city of Seattle and the fine bureaucrats said, sure you go, here's a permit to make money off a house that isn't yours and that you aren't paying rent on. It's the craziest story I have ever heard, and I hate to laugh. But even Jason has to laugh at certain points to avoid crying. But he brought up during our interview, again, you should absolutely go watch the full interview at undividedpod.com. Become a subscriber. It aired yesterday on Sundays with subscribers. He brought up what really came to my mind, which is here is a young man doing everything right and providing an affordable home, affordable housing to the community who is getting absolutely screwed.
And what drives me crazy of all this stuff, what drives me the most crazy is that I listen to the council member debates. I try to stay up on local politics. Everyone talks about affordable housing. We need to build more affordable housing. The county and the city are not going to build affordable housing. It's people like me who are making it happen. And I know landlords, the connotation of a landlord is evil, but they're the ones providing the housing. So why am I fronting the burden here? If it's such a big deal to help people with these, with rental assistance, then let me qualify for some assistance.
Yeah. I mean, he's the one living in a van. He's the one living in a van now. And I said at the beginning, I would feel bad for any landlord in this situation. But there's just something that pulls at my heartstrings about Jason Roth, his kindness, his compassion toward other people, his dog. I always have sympathy for a dog. But even he said he had such a trusting nature, and now he's left just wondering, why is this happening to me?
There just has to be some sort of narrative shift that like landlord, and if you own a business and you own a house, you're not inherently evil. Like I love to fix things and improve things, just like someone might like to go out and, people buy and restore furniture. Like I saved up forever because I wanted to buy an old house and fix it up and rent it to my friends. People need to see that, like, that's how I can add value. Some people's skill sets. I understand there's going to be evil landlords out there, like slumlords, but there should be Wally. There should be checks and balances for that, but I should be, I don't know, getting
Wally's
heated just thinking about this.
Well, you're doing everything right. I mean, do you feel sometimes like you're being punished for being like a good person?
Yeah. In the city that I've paid taxes in and lived in forever, and went and gave homeless to the clothing to the homeless in front of my house, like picked up trash in my neighborhood, cleaned up the green belt, like all the stuff I've been trying to do since I moved back to Seattle in the last 6-7 years. It's like I'm getting punished. I keep trying to rack my brain. Why? Like, what did I do to get this short end of the stick?
You lived in Seattle. You lived in Seattle, where hardworking people, small business owners, small landlords get absolutely screwed in the name of some weird fringe woke ideology that protects a tenant like that over a guy like Jason. So he was trying to handle this on his own, living in his van with his dog Wally, paying for an attorney that he simply doesn't have the money for. He's out $30,000, $40,000 total because of this whole ordeal, put his life on hold to deal with it. No end in sight. No end in sight. Has an eviction hearing finally this month, but it could be delayed. He says they often are because the Housing Justice Project comes in and finds technicalities to get it delayed on. Was told by his attorney that this might not be resolved until 2025, and that'll leave him destitute. So anyway, then he finally decides to reach out to the media. Jesse Jones over at Cairo 7 had profiled his story recently, and he decided to reach out to the media because he had an interaction with this tenant, and now I use that word loosely because it's really a squatter, and he could not believe the callousness that this man squatting in his home showed to him. Have you tried to appeal to his emotions?
I have access to my garage, which I load some of the things in there because I can't fit it all in my van that I sleep in. And I was there a few weeks ago, and he came out recording me accessing the garage, and I was in tears yelling back at him about how he's ruining my life. What more do you want from me? Do you want the shirt off my back? Because you're ruining my life. You've taken my home. And he's filming me, accusing me of being, he said to me, you own so many properties. Why are you hurting the little guy? I mean, making up lies. I mean, the guy it was at that point that I got very angry and it took it very personally, because even until then I was like, I like to assume the best in people. I've generally been a pretty cheerful, optimistic person my whole life. But that was like you took the knife and twisted it. He was trying to create some content or something that made me look terrible. And that's when I called Jesse and started.
Yeah, you did Jesse Jones, get Jesse.
I had to get him at that point.
Yeah, and then he got Brandi. I tell you what, this is the right show to get. Because the reason we were a little delayed on the show today is because we found a gem, ladies and gentlemen. Oh, did we find a gem? Oh, do I feel good about it? I feel terrible about it, but I feel great about it. So you heard him say there that here you have this individual squatting. He finds out doing his own research that this particular tenant has done stuff like this before. It's not the first time he's done it. You hear Jason Roth say, I want to think the best in people. I want to believe they have the best intentions. And I'm sure there are people who've seen this headline about this landlord homeless, who will be like, well, this person might be down on their luck. Okay. So we're not going to name the tenant today because there is an eviction hearing coming up. We'll give him his day in court. Now, I think we'll probably be there, and we sure as hell will name him after the court hearing happens. But we stumbled upon and have been able to confirm and verify that it is, in fact, the account. We've stumbled upon the Instagram account of the man who's living rent-free in Jason Roth's South Seattle home. Now, imagine how infuriated you would be to be in this situation, to have someone living in your home for free, listing it on Airbnb, painting you as the bad guy, confronting you and trying to put you on video. Now imagine how angry you would be as Jason Roth to see videos on this person's Instagram account showing him throwing parties at your house. Throwing parties, having friends over, having a good time in the house you bought at the age of 25 that you rented out and never got a freaking dime for. $1,000. Now, put yourself in the shoes of Jason Roth, who again, hey, maybe this guy is down on his luck. Maybe he lost a job. Maybe he just can't afford to pay rent. Well, it turns out this particular tenant is living, or at least pretending to live, a lavish lifestyle. Spends a lot of time at the gym, showing pictures of his abs. Spends a lot of time at the gym for someone who could be out looking for a job. Posts inspirational quotes about how hard he's working, about living his dreams. Posting videos on vacation. Posting photos of yachts. Videos of the inside of yachts. Says he runs a business that hosts yacht parties.
You didn't tell me about the bar, what? Oh yeah, no, I want to.
Taking videos for his followers, showing that he's staying at lavish properties on the water. He has all these businesses that he says he dabbles in. He's an entrepreneur. In one of his posts, he said that becoming a millionaire was an old dream of his, as if the new dream is to become a billionaire. Talks about how hard he works, how hard he's working, how people don't appreciate hard work. All the while squatting in a 32-year-old's home, not paying him a dime, while that 32-year-old sleeps in a van with his dog. So that should erase any sympathy you have for the man squatting in Jason Roth's home, who is clearly taking advantage of a system and of policies that are designed to protect tenants like him over hardworking people like Jason. It's not right. It is not morally right. Yes, are there terrible landlords? Of course there are. But they are the exception, not the rule. And for Seattle progressives and politicians who scream left and right about big bad landlords, if you continue down this path, that is all the landlords that the city will have. You will scare away small landlords like Jason Roth, who do this community a service, who are good people, who provide an affordable place to live. And the only landlords who will survive are the landlords that can afford to survive. The big landlords, the very landlords you take issue with. A system that protects that man over Jason Roth is not a system that is working. So we are going to follow this case to its resolution. Again, there is an eviction hearing finally this month. Jason Roth is very concerned that it's just going to be pushed down the road because of the Housing Justice Project that's going to represent this man pro bono. But we will be in the courtroom. And yes, we have more information on this tenant, by the way, including his name, including other things that are similar to this, that we are going to absolutely unload after that eviction hearing if it gets pushed down even further. I will also tell you that we have reached out to our friends. This is a segment that's sponsored by Future 42. I'm an ambassador for Future 42, and they have a tie to something called the Citizen Action Defense Fund. And so we've reached out to our friends at the Citizen Action Defense Fund. They've been in contact with Jason Roth to see if there's anything they can do to help him out. One of the things Jason Roth said he wants to see happen is for some landlord to fight this type of case to the end, to fight tooth and nail, not to give up. He said, I don't have the money to do that. I don't have the energy to do that, but he wants someone to. Because he says too often what happens is these landlords are so tired, they're so broke, they're so beat down because of this system that they're willing to take a settlement. They're willing to take settlements from people for pennies on the dollar just to move on. And then you have those tenants who they got a settlement, so now they don't have an eviction on their record. And they move on and they do this to someone else. Come on, this is not the kind of city that we want. This is not the kind of county we want. These are not the kind of rules and protections that should be in place that can be easily taken advantage of. Should there be protections for tenants? Of course. But this is ridiculous. And Jason Roth was also told that even if he wins the eviction hearing, in fact, he was sitting in the seat next to me before our interview, and he got a call from the King County Sheriff's Office. And they told him, hey, we're months behind on actually carrying out these evictions. So even whenever it happens, your case is resolved, it could be months before we can get someone out there to actually enforce the eviction. This isn't right. It needs to be fixed. I'm glad the Citizen Action Defense Fund is looking into it. I'm glad Jason Roth is telling his story. And I sure hope that there's a resolution for him at some point in the near future, because he doesn't deserve what's happening to him. All right, that segment was brought to you in partnership by our friends over at Future 42. Turn your frustration into action at future42.org. I laugh because there is no shortage of frustration given our current political environment. This is absolute insanity. All right, this is quite the switch. Where do people in the city of Seattle pee? That is the subject of dogged journalism from the Seattle Times. Let's get to it in our segment, Unbelievable. As the Seattle Times was busy over the weekend carrying water for pro-Hamas sympathizers, they were also doing some, I gotta say, Pulitzer Prize winning journalism. The subject of a story in the Seattle Times over the weekend, headline, "Where do people pee in Seattle? Bushes, bottles, and Pike Place Market." Now, on its face, this was intended to be a sympathetic piece for the homeless. It was actually part of their Project Homelessness at the Seattle Times, where they actually have a sponsored project that they cover issues around homelessness, obviously always from the perspective of homeless individuals. And so that's when I first saw this, I thought, oh gosh, they're going to complain that there's no place for homeless people to pee. And so they're peeing in bushes and bottles in Pike Place Market. But one of the things that they did is also talk to Seattleites who very much have a place to live, but who visit downtown Seattle and are apparently shocked that there aren't public restrooms for them to go and use while they're down there. One guy told them, one user who has irritable bowel syndrome, you're going to make me read this quote. I very nearly pooped myself more times than I can count. I've navigated hospital buildings and pretended to have an appointment. I've run into the woods, hobbled into alleyways, slipped past baristas, acted like I work in buildings, and jumped into countless portable bathrooms on or near construction sites. The Seattle Times goes on to say a reader named Dylan said he was initially disturbed when he saw a person he perceived as homeless peeing into a storm drain outside a library. Then he realized the library wasn't open yet, and he reconsidered his opinion. Woe is this homeless person peeing into a storm drain. Seattle Times goes on to say another person was stranded in her wheelchair while waiting for a ride after visiting a food bank that didn't have a restroom she could use. Quote, I wound up urinating all over myself in my wheelchair, the reader wrote. Disabled people are directly impacted by these choices. They go on to say, Ren Wilcox, who lives in Seattle, added, the war on homeless people has also become a war on disabled people, and it makes our city so hostile. So there it is. There is the crux of an entire expose the Seattle Times dedicated journalists to, by the way, two of them it took to write this. There's the crux of the story on, there's no place to pee in Seattle. They say there's no place to pee because there's a war on the homeless. The state's largest newspaper, ladies and gentlemen, there's no place to pee because there's a war on the homeless. Now, don't get me wrong, there is a tie between Seattle's homelessness crisis and the fact that there is really no place to pee. I was in Eastern Washington over the weekend and I stopped at a Starbucks in Richland on my way home. And I was delighted that I could use the bathroom at that particular Starbucks without entering a code and without having to get a key. I could just open it up, walk right in, do my business, walk out. Why is that? Well, it's because Richland doesn't have a homelessness crisis. It doesn't have a substance abuse crisis. It doesn't have a mental health crisis. And so businesses there are not forced to put their restrooms under lock and key, as has been the case in Seattle. Do you really blame any business, big or small, in Seattle for locking their restrooms in the midst of a drug crisis? They do it for a reason. They do it because their restrooms had become drug dens and absolute filth, because people who weren't customers would come in and use them and shoot up or do whatever they wanted to do in there. There's a reason why businesses have put their bathrooms under lock and key. There's a reason why there are so few public restrooms in Seattle. It is because the homelessness crisis has gotten so severe. The drug crisis has gotten so severe. And entities like the Seattle Times engage not in the vilification of the political environment that allowed this to happen, but they engage in journalism that makes this seem like an unreasonable war, a hateful war on the homeless. No, this is common sense. You're trying to run a business. You want customers to come in. You own the business. You own the restroom inside the business. You get to decide who can use it and who can't use it. Is it ideal? Of course not. But this is the environment that Seattle policies have created, and that ridiculous journalism like this has allowed to continue. Absolutely unbelievable. And oh boy, we're having a long show today. Whew, I'm getting hot. It's because we had so much good stuff today. That's all right. We'll keep trucking on. You guys can hang out with us. Before we dip outside Washington State, I've been talking about my friends at First Mark Insurance because I love them. And I love being a member of the First Mark family. Mike and I moved all of our insurance over to First Mark in the spring. Every insurance we have for our house, for both our vehicles, gosh, my ring insurance, our life insurance, everything now is housed by First Mark. We love that for a variety of reasons. One, if we have a claim, if we have an issue, we don't have to figure out, okay, who's our insurance with, call the phone tree, get on hold for someone in a different state or a different country to help us through our crisis. No, we call First Mark, a local veteran-owned company that's been doing this for a long time. And we say, hey, we've got an issue. We need to make a claim. And then they handle it for us, which is really, really nice. So I encourage you, it's free. Take the First Mark Challenge. What you do is you schedule some time online. You talk through your current insurance, your insurance needs. They go out for free. They shop the market for you. They come back and they make recommendations. Here's Dave Taylor. He's the CEO of First Mark, explaining what they hope you take away from the First Mark Challenge.
One of our goals that we say is that we believe everybody deserves to feel confident about their insurance. And so that's really one of our primary drivers of those conversations is we don't expect you to remember everything we talked about, but we hope that at the end of that process, you're going to feel confident that you have what you need, and also confident that if you have a question, someone's going to pick up the phone and take care of it for you down the road.
Yeah, so do what I've done, do what so many others have done. Take the First Mark Challenge. There is no downside to it. It just costs you a little bit of time. They might come back and say, hey, your insurance is just fine. Stay with what you have, but you've learned something in the process. So firstmarkinsurance.com, firstmarkinsurance.com, they work for you. Okay, dipping outside Washington State, although I would argue this next clip has a lot to do with what's happening in Washington State. Arnold Schwarzenegger. He is, of course, a Republican, but I would consider him a pretty moderate Republican. I think that's fair. He was doing an interview and talked about what's happening in Democratic cities. And he seems to very much agree that, first of all, it's baffling some of the policy decisions and the state of things. If you look at San Francisco, if you look at Portland, if you look at Seattle, and he says that the only conclusion he can come to is that this is some sort of intentional destruction of once great cities.
Okay, let me ask you this, and I ask people this all the time. David Dreyer, good friend of ours.
Yeah.
Yes, and a good man. Served for many, many, many years. He used to have the greatest what makes me a Republican. And he had, I think, 4 or 5 things. I think it was, in no particular, strong military, low taxes, less government, more personal freedoms. There might have been a couple, but it makes sense to know.
Strong law enforcement.
Strong law enforcement. And then I'd like to know I always ask Democrats what it means to be a Democrat in that way, and I think whatever anybody would say,
ruin your cities.
What would they say?
Ruin your cities.
What's that?
Ruin your cities.
Ruin your cities.
That's what the Democrats would say. Be about ruining the cities. We want to up every city in America. That's what it seems to be the theme right now.
Why is that?
I have no idea.
I have no idea either. I'm glad that Arnold Schwarzenegger is as stumped as I am as to some of these policies. I think a lot of people who support progressive policies, they do it from a place, like a good place in their hearts. I think there are a lot of voters who think that way, and they think that that's compassion. But in practice, we've seen that it's not compassionate. I mean, look at people dying on our streets at record numbers. Look at the crime crisis. Look what happens to landlords like Jason Roth. And so then you get to a point where, okay, people continue to vote for those same policies that are ruining. I mean, how can you argue that a city like San Francisco has been ruined? How can you argue that a city like Portland hasn't been ruined? How can you argue that a city like Seattle hasn't been ruined? I would challenge you. You can't. These are not the same cities that they were 5, 10, 20 years ago. And so it leaves you really wondering, are people's views, are they that stuck in their ideology that they can't see what's happening and they don't want these things to be fixed? So anyway, I agree. And I didn't know Rob Lowe was talked about politics. Have you ever listened to that podcast of his?
I haven't, but I like him. So I didn't know, I didn't know that he supported Arnold. Apparently he was the first endorsement he received. And
didn't know that either.
Yeah. And it's a really good interview, I will say. It's pretty interesting because he talks a lot more about politics. We couldn't couldn't play all of it.
Yeah.
But he does talk about how when he was a Republican elected in California, right? And he said, it's because I talked about the city as our city, not my city.
Yeah.
And so I think that all these politicians get up there and they're like, they single out a party. They say, we'll fight for our city as a Republican or as a Democrat, instead of saying, this is all of our cities, Republicans and Democrat, and this is our city and we need to fix it. And I don't know, he talks about kind of his approach on that and why he thinks it was successful.
Well, I really don't, and obviously there's sides, and sides win because they want to push their policy proposals and they want, to push their values. I get it, but I think a good leader also recognizes, like in a state like Washington, 7.5 million people, two very different sides of the state with very different needs and wants. And I think a good leader would recognize that and say, okay, I know I have my personal desires and wishes and policies that I support, but how is this going to impact people who disagree with me entirely or who want to live their life in different ways? And that's why I'm in favor of limited government, because the more limited a government's approach is or a governor's approach is, the more people get to decide for themselves how to live their best life within obviously the confines of the law. And I think that's the real only way, if you limit government interference in people's lives, to have a state like Washington where views are so diverse and lifestyles are so diverse, where the most possible people can be as happy as they possibly can be. That's the only way.
Right.
So anyway, I thought
he
that was
also
really
just said he
interesting.
didn't cave to either party. He just said, I was, Democrats didn't always like me because I was fiscally conservative, and Republicans didn't always like me because I was socially somewhat liberal, and
no one
and
likes
he just
moderates.
He didn't play to it.
Yeah,
and maybe that works.
The party, there's a reason why the parties, vilify moderates. Why a lot of, I'm not saying generally every single state party vilifies moderates, but I think certainly the national parties, it's because that's not what they want. They want a clear delineation between the two parties. Cooperation doesn't bode well. Where I actually think cooperation, if you stuck to it and you worked together, the American people would love that. But then you start to blur those lines and they're like, well, how can we convince American people to vote for us if we're working with the other party so much? It's absolutely worthless.
And both are just catering to the loudest. It's
100%.
Annoying.
Okay. All right, Nicole, thank you. I've been talking about Eastside Weight Loss Clinic, eastsideweightlossklinic.com. I'm just tickled to see how many of you have started the program. I was at an event out east this weekend. I had a trio of events. It was a busy weekend. And you would not believe how many people came up to me and told me how great I look. Thank you. In fact, I was at the Washington Policy Center dinner. I emceed it. That picture on the left I always show when I show the thing is from that last year. And so I went back with a very similar dress. I'll have to find a photo and swap it so you can see the side by side. But it was the Washington Policy Center event last year, and the pictures I saw of myself at it that made me start the Eastside Weight Loss Clinic plan. So to be back a year later feeling so much better was great. So if you've been thinking about starting the program, but you don't know if it's right for you, that's fine. That's why you can do a free 15-minute consultation. Talk to Dr. Ryan Coogan and his team with about any questions or concerns you might have before you invest in it. eastsideweightlossklinic.com, eastsideweightlossklinic.com. Okay, questions and comments. We're doing a long show today. It's fine. We had so much good content. All right, truth first on the media and the bizarrely similar coverage that this pro-Palestine and, among some people, pro-Hamas rally garnered. Truth First says, and they never reported the violence in Kirkland either, just mentioned the protests. The indoctrination runs deep in this state for sure, at least in King County. Kathy Carr said, I cannot stand the Seattle news stations. I've been watching BBC, but it is so very sad. Yeah, I watch BBC a lot, too, for international coverage. I think they do a good job. Rick Johnson says, a corporately owned and controlled press can clearly not be free and independent. Hey, that's why you should be paying $5 a month for unDivided so we can continue to do our job absent of what the corporate media is doing. All right, Spencer Cole says, Trump has been calling out the media for years. Fake news doesn't stop with CNN. Yeah, I didn't like the way Trump always called out the media, though. I thought that I think when you give specific examples of the way the media is failing, that's fine. But I think he took his criticism of the media too far sometimes in a way that I remember when I was in the media would lead to unfair vilification or blanket vilification. And I didn't like that. All right. On Shasti Conrad, the chair of the Washington State Democratic Party, who says that she wants supermajority so they can clean up the state constitution. Two Ladies Midwest Adventures says, please, if you haven't read the Communist Manifesto, please do so. Brandi, I know you're a powerful reader. This is definitely important. Powerful reader. Does that mean I'm like a fast reader? What does it mean to be a powerful reader? Yeah.
Yep.
I actually am a pretty fast reader, but that's why I read books twice usually, because I go, and then I'm like, oh, I didn't absorb a lot of that, so I was like, go back and take notes. Todd Welch said, Shasti Conrad is openly saying to change state constitution to allow a state progressive income tax. Yeah, they want to change it in their image. On Jason Roth, the landlord, who I just feel so bad for. Bryce Ancheta Real Estate says, to expand the tenant laws statewide, it will destroy the rental market, hurt an investor who has 100 units and will sell them if passed by voters. Is there something missing from that comment at the beginning? Can you double check that? Matthew Cook says...
He said he heard about
an effort to expand the tenant laws statewide.
Well, I just think he's saying if it expands anymore, he's already heard about this investor that sold 100 units.
Yeah. Well, and we're going to talk Insanity Check today about, we always warn. We talk about Seattle not because we think every single one of you live in Seattle, but because there are consequences to the state's largest city and the policies that they put forward. They find their way to the rest of the state. They absolutely do. And these really, really unreasonable tenant protections. There's reasonable tenant protections. The truly unreasonable ones have originated in Seattle. And it's only a matter of time before every single landlord in the state has to abide by them. Matthew Cook says, landlords have enough and sell. Who swoops in and buys property? Yep. Matt Gilbert says, increase. Oh, no, I'm not reading that one. Matt, no condoning crime.
No, we're not, obviously. And I don't take him literal. I mean, he probably means literal.
Don't read it.
But I did want to use that to kind of bring up. So he says, get first mark insurance and insure the house.
I said don't read it.
But what Jason talked about quite a bit is that people keep saying, why don't you just go in there, drag them out? Why don't you just go in there, change the locks? Why don't you turn off the water, turn off the gas, whatever it is? But all of those things would be punishable by...
He said I'd go to jail.
Yes, like he would be punished and it would be an even bigger headache for him. And especially the turning off water and electricity, that's like illegal. I mean, nobody's going to do any of these things. Nothing's going to help him. And trust me, I think he's thought of it all.
Yeah. Well, actually, I had somebody comment on the Sundays with Subscribers episode. I'm not going to remember it exactly, but they said something to the effect of, you have a right as a landlord to enter, the tenant's home. Mm-hmm. You just got to give them a certain amount of notice. Mm-hmm. So to do that, and then to make repairs. So like take every door out of the house because it has to be repainted inside and outside and then put up like a temporary door and stuff. So it just makes life absolutely miserable. And he couldn't have his little parties with his friends because who wants to take their friends to a house that has no doors?
Right.
So you could do that or just consistently say, I'm, exercising my right as a landlord to come and do this or do that. But
again, he's just going to take it out on his house, right?
I know. I don't even want to know what his house is going to look like
when
this guy eventually gets evicted.
Mm-hmm.
All right, let's see. Carol says the laws need to change for homeowners with non-paying tenants. This deadbeat renter needs to go to jail. I don't disagree. Andy says Seattle hates small landlords and the middle class. Let me see here. Andy also said, give me the account, Brandi. I'll make him famous. Mm-hmm. Hey, okay, we're trying to be reasonable. Although I was like, absolutely. That is so relevant for a judge to even hear. Hey, this isn't some guy who's down on his luck. He says that he has multiple businesses, including a yachting business. He's taking videos inside yachts. He's taking videos at the beach. He's always posting, and he has nice abs, I will say. Congratulations. But you can't get abs that nice unless you spend a lot of time at the gym. Mm-hmm. It sounds like he ought to be spending more time working to try to pay his rent. So that's totally relevant to the current situation and shows this isn't someone who's down on his luck.
No.
So anyway, or unless these are total scams he's running and he's not actually making any money.
Well, I don't know about that, but I do think that there's quite a few scams, and Jason is looking into that. We are kind of trying to investigate that a little bit more because it appears that he might run a business, get investors.
Well, let's not get too deep into that until we vet it.
But I'm just saying, this is the extent this guy is going to. He is, trying to manipulate whatever system he can.
Yeah, and then he's posting quotes about how he's, working hard and living his dreams. You know who else worked hard? Jason Roth.
Yes.
To buy that house at the age of 25, to flip it, to give you a place to live, only for you to screw him over. Crazy stuff.
Terrible.
Chrisman says, turn off the water and electricity. Lieutenant Dan says this guy should be publicly shamed out of Seattle. I mean, there might come a
We might
point
get
where
there.
if they're going to go through all these legal maneuvers to unfairly, push this thing down the road, then I think that we might feel differently about a little name and shame and diving deeper into some of these background issues that have allowed for this to happen. All right, coming up next, our closing sanity check, we'll talk about how indeed, so many of Seattle's crises, including the crime crisis, are not staying in Seattle. They are going to other places. But first, we've been talking about Bulwark Capital and our friend Zach Abraham. If you want to check them out, knowyourriskradio.com. He also hosts a radio show where they talk about your risk. And in an economy like this one, you should be keenly aware of the risks associated with it. Bidenomics is basically a big house of cards. And are you properly protected when it comes crashing down? Whether you're just starting to save for retirement or whether you are almost to retirement, it's important to know that you are managing your risk well. Here's Zach Abraham.
We think the world is going insane. We think that the world is propped up on all kinds of, we don't think, we know, propped up printed money, and you're playing a game that has to end badly, right? Now, when it ends, when you hear all these prognosticators financially talking about when it ends, it kind of reminds me of when God's coming back. Nobody knows, right? But what it does mean is that you need a portfolio that can do two things. It can keep up with inflation and not get you buried. But also, when the inevitability of living and perpetuating an economy on printed money, when that inevitability comes to the fore, you need a portfolio that can stand up against anything, right?
Yeah, so know your risk and take steps to mitigate those risks. Zach Abraham and his team at Bulwark Capital can help you with that. Visit them, knowyourriskradio.com, knowyourriskradio.com. And with that, let's get to our closing sanity check. One of the most high-profile crimes, and it was really a crime spree that happened in the city of Seattle over the summer, and there were many of them, were these random attacks on elderly Asian Americans. There have been arrests made, of course, but we showed the video so many times with a group of young men who would find mostly elderly Asian Americans. They might be coming into their home and then would confront them, usually armed. In one instance, they tased a guy and robbed them. And, I think it can sometimes be easy when we talk about, all the homicides happening in Seattle and the street disorder in Seattle and, the attacks on Asian Americans in Seattle. It can be easy, I think, if you're outside of Seattle to be like, oh, kooky Seattle and their kooky policies. But we've warned over and over, these issues spill out. And in fact, unfortunately, there was a crime in Kent very, very, very similar to these attacks on elderly Asian Americans in Seattle. I want to show you the video. So you see these two come home. The man goes in the house first, and then his wife follows behind. She glances back and sees someone running at her, armed, with a gun, thankfully. And I don't know how she did that so fast. She flips around, closes the door, locks it. He can't get in. So he's standing at the door with a gun, sees the video on him, the Ring camera, trying to destroy it with the butt of the gun. And in the background, you also see there's a second figure with him. Very, very similar to what was happening in Seattle. It's insane to believe that crime and disorder and the issues of Seattle stop at the border to Seattle. If we don't stop these policies now, if we don't stop this now, it is going to continue to spread. And so voters, again, I plead with you, not only this November as ballots come out in a couple days, but now until the 2024 election, to really ask yourself, what are my priorities? What kind of community do I want to live in? And to spend every single day, whether there's an election coming up or not, fighting to make that a reality. All right, that has been it for today's episode of Undivided. We did restock our swag store, so if you needed some different sizes and t-shirts and it was sold out, please check out the swag store, undividedpod.com, undividedpod.com. And we'll see you back on the live show coming up tomorrow at noon. If you've not done it already, though, go watch that full interview with Jason Ross. Support our mission and our movement. Ross? Did I say Ross? Jason Roth. Go to undividedpod.com, undividedpod.com. Sign up for $5 a month. Catch that episode of Sundays with Subscribers and every episode of Sundays with Subscribers. See you guys tomorrow.